So I've suggested that the terms pride and prejudice represent two contending historical forces. Um, Pride, the force of tradition, um, prejudice, the new modern speed of communication, insatiable consumer desire, um, chatter. And I'm suggesting further that Austen's narrative innovation, the experience of reading Austen's novels, um, represents a new experience of time, a new experience of appreciation for history, combined with a new sharpness and attentiveness to irony, and the this new speed of modern interaction. Jane Austen presents reading as a significant embodied practice in its own right, and it's contrasted with social behaviors emblematized by a number of different characters in Pride and Prejudice that I'm going to go through now, that are presented as mechanically reinforcing the ideology, particularly of patriarchy. So, two things I want to mention that might be illuminating of what I'm saying here. One is that Austen herself declined to marry and devoted herself to a life of literature. A very short life, died in her early 40s. That's illuminating. She declined to marry in order to write marriage novels. In Romanticism in general, we're telling stories about failed, absent, hollowed out characters, and thereby creating new kinds of character, new kinds of community of readers. That's a theme, you know, from Wordsworth. You, I don't have a story. You tell me what the story is. You are creating something significant through the experience of reading. Something socially significant is at stake in the experience of literature. So that's what I want to emphasize in Austen's uh, biographical embodiment of a literary life. Um, and that might represent something new and new kind of personhood, new kind of society is made available through the pastime itself of literature, and how that ennobles a traditionally disparaged female domestic scene. The other thing I want to highlight is Persuasion begins with the discussion of the baronetcy, which is this book that of ancestry that just delineates the various nobility in excruciating detail. The shallowness of a particular character, the patriarch, in Persuasion is indicated by his obsession with rereading this book. So characters in Pride and Prejudice fall prey to the conflict between Pride and Prejudice in various ways. There's that one character, sorry, I'm blanking on the name, who's always falling asleep. He's great in the BBC version. He's like, people are having conversations, the plot is going on around him, and he's always like dozing off in the background. It's a perfect spoof on um, aristocratic sluggishness, that, or pride. He has so much pride. He's basically inert. He's so complacent. But I want to look through a number of examples of people fail to read in the way that Austen is teaching us to read these complexities of social reality. This passage here from chapter 13, Mr. Bennett acknowledging reality. Mr. Collins, when I'm dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. But he makes a joke out of it, which is a kind of denial. It's like, dude, that's actually not funny. And um, the um, question of reading is raised here in a subtle way too, um, in a relation to Mrs. Bennett. Like she's saying, don't talk about that. I mean, I think she's right. Not to say don't talk about it, but don't talk about it in this dismissive um, uh, way. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world. That's, I mean, in a way, I love how Austen sneaks in these statements that are actually quite penetrating and profound, in the mouth of the last person you'd expect to say anything insightful. Um, so, um, now this is interesting, this paragraph here. Um, Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain to her the nature of an entail. It's as if they're explaining it to the reader of the novel, because, I mean, Austen had withheld that circumstance of their situation in order to, maybe d- uh, draw the reader into a lighter seeming romantic narrative. Um, not so hard, an easier story. And now they're explaining it to her, but they're also sort of asking the reader, "Do you understand?" Um, they'd often attempted to do it before, like, we've mentioned the entail, but do you get the point, reader? Um, it was a subject on which Miss Bennet was beyond the reach of reason, and she continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling in state away from a family of 5 daughters in favor of a man whom nobody cared anything about. That's great. It's like she's saying, Mr. in favor of a man nobody cared any about. Like that's what's happening in this novel. Like, you don't like Mr. Collins, but he's the one who's gonna inherit it all. I love here how she's putting aligning the reader with, or asking the reader implicitly, if you're gonna stay in the kind of fantasy land of denial that Miss Bennet is in, even as we think we're so much smarter than she is. Second example, Miss Bingley, she is a figure of, you know, envy. She envies Lizzie because Darcy pays more attention to her, and so she leverages patriarchal power to punish the Bennets, and Jane in particular. And what so I think what's important about the idea of resentment is it's self-destructive, even as if she's trying to hurt Jane, but she's also not doing herself any favors. She's leveraging, male privilege to hurt another woman, but she's also undermining her own position as a woman. Um, and what I like about this is the power of the letter, and the way that's underscored again, the power of the book. She's just asserting my ability to cause pain through writing, the power of dogmatic language, privilege entitlement that is exercised through language, in this case, writing a letter. And I like how Jane so perceptively identifies it in grammatical terms. This sentence that sentence says a lot. Um, uh, she recognizes the power of this piece of grammar itself. My third example, Charlotte, is more complex. These aren't schematic. I do think Mr. Bennett is a more complex character than Mrs. Bennett. And I think Charlotte is interesting. I mean, psychologically interesting as a non-romantic. I think there's something compelling. Austen gives her anti-romanticism a legitimacy. She's just kind of saying, I'm not into approaching marriage as the economic institution that it is in realistic terms. And in the BBC version, I'm really fond of that performance. She gives that attitude of dignity and poise that is compelling. But it's troubling too. Elizabeth's reaction to it is, I mean, it's important. It shines a light. It's such a humiliating picture. There's something deeply degrading. Marriage is not just an economic institution. It's a intimate relationship. Elizabeth's reaction to it is very strong. I mean, she felt persuaded that no real confidence could ever subsist between them again. That's a interesting thing to think about. Would you to have a reaction like that to somebody's relationship with somebody else? Could you go over that far? Like, if somebody, a friend of yours, entered into a intimate relationship, a significant relationship with somebody else that you didn't agree with or you found humiliating, would that fundamentally change your relationship with that person? Other complicating features here. Charlotte makes she is wise, and it makes a very insightful observation about Elizabeth, which is she doesn't make allowance enough for differences of situation and temper. That is a key problem of Elizabeth's prejudice. These are both valid insights. Again, the complexity of Austen's narrative. I thought this is very interesting line. So it's the narrator reporting on what Elizabeth is thinking about Charlotte, what Charlotte's thinking about Mr. Collins, what the rest of the society is thinking about Mr. Collins. This is novelistic intelligence, thinking about these various, multiple degrees of separation, these ironies in these interplay of perspectives that Austen's novels are giving us exercise in. Reading Austen is training us in reading this complex social reality. So who's judging the wisdom here? When Mr. Collins said anything of which his wife might reasonably be ashamed, which certainly was not seldom, she involuntarily turned her eye on Charlotte. So Elizabeth involuntarily turned her eye on Charlotte. So, how does she react to that? Once or twice she could discern a faint blush, but in general Charlotte wisely did not hear. It's almost like Elizabeth is hoping that Charlotte's being wise. There's a contradiction here. Like, you don't choose not to hear. You either hear or you don't. You don't exercise judgment about what you hear, right? You might exercise judgment what you listen to, what you pay attention to. There's a tension in that wording here that demonstrates this ambivalence of Charlotte's predicament, of ambivalence that Elizabeth's feeling. That's what's getting communicated is the ambivalence, rather than any stable judgment. That's the tension, the dynamism of irony, and the complexity, the dance involved in negotiating a particular social predicament that Austen is involving us in, putting us through those paces. Another kind of failure of reading is exemplified, ironically, by the most literary, textual, in an academic sense, characters, Collins and Mary, the most bookish, um, uh, um, emphatically bookish characters, um, are bad readers, um, in their dogmatism, their adherence to the letter of the text. You know, Mary at the beginning gives us that dictionary definition of pride, and in a way that is obviously meant to demonstrate how little that tells us. The dictionary definition of words um, explains so little of the social reality. Hence the importance of literature, of stories, to work through the complexity of the social dance. It's funny at first when Mary offers that all too literal definition of what pride means, but at the end it's horrifying. Its correlation with Collins's literalism, his moralistic view on the fallen woman, is like, you're no longer a person, you're no longer a member of the family. To console yourself as much as possible and throw off your unworthy child from your affection forever and leave her to reap the fruits of her own heinous offense. That's the violence of language that we saw him exercise in his proposal to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth here is likewise shocked by Mary. There's a lot of talk in Pride and Prejudice about the romance of uniforms, but I think an interesting way to look at this is also in the inverse way, as in terms of the uniformity of romance, or romance reduced to uniform formula. Because the character of Wickham, again, who meets, evokes flame, he's seductive to a wide array of characters. He's uniformly seductive. So Austen's sort of making us think about the formula, the uniformity of the romantic hero, of romantic individuality. Lady Catherine as well. There's something, she's an aristocrat, but she's too explicit about her claims to aristocratic prestige. This explicitness is both the point of Edmund Burke's text, the point that Edmund Burke makes, but also I've suggested maybe the problem of with inherent in Edmund Burke's text is that you can't come out and say that aristocracy is prestigious. The saying of it undermines the point that you're trying to make. If the prestige is implicit and should compel reverence, then coming out and saying it, making it explicit in the way Collins and Lady Catherine are always doing, they undermine the prestige that they're claiming. It's prestige that demands to go unspoken. What's interesting here is how in this passage, we see precisely what it means to read between the lines, to experience a gravity of social authority by reading between the lines. So Elizabeth responds to the way in which her mother is embarrassing herself, or Collins is embarrassing himself at the ball. Um, and but she's reading between the lines, like how is Darcy reading them? How is Darcy reading her through them, through their behavior? Though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was invariably fixed by her. The expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. So she's feeling gravity through this complex um, reading of the social interaction. Correlation of the ability to read ironically and the ability to dance is underscored remarkably complexly in a dance when Elizabeth and Darcy are talking in a dance, and they're talking about books, but they're talking about not being able to talk about books while they're dancing. Um, cannot talk of books in a ballroom. My head is always full of something else. And here she talks about the gravity that she is oppressed by, that she mentions before. And this also points out the problem with Darcy's pride. She's questioning him about his stubbornness. I remember hearing you once say that you hardly ever forgave, that your resentment once created was unappeasable. There's a problematic dogmatism there that she's pointing out, and that she's suffering at the same time. We see her kind of stuck. I'm trying to figure you out, um, endeavoring to shake off her gravity, like she's unable to dance. And she's unable to think and read him. I'm trying to make your character out. I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly. Um, it's really compelling. Her reading is being frustrated, and that's evoked as a kind of sluggishness, a heaviness that doesn't dance. And there's something self-referential here, I think, in Darcy's response. He he's mad at her judgment of him, but the way in which he formulates his frustration is could apply to his own behavior as well. He'd be wise to heed it, because here he says that character is a matter of performance. It's not something you can judge once or for all. Character is something that is performed. Character is a dance-like performance, socially interactive kind of performance, as is illustrated earlier in this chapter 18, in one of my favorite uh, examples of the dance of flirtation. So Lizzie doesn't want anything to do with Darcy because what she overheard him say offended her. But Charlotte urges her. So this is interesting because, Charlotte is the anti-romantic, but she's saying dance because don't be simple. It'd be stupid not to dance for pragmatic, utilitarian, self-interested reasons, not for romantic reasons. So that's already ironic. And Elizabeth starts out here as the spectator, like amazed at herself being there, but she takes charge and initiates a dance of irony that's just reads really, really modern. It's just so clever, because she's reflecting on what they're supposed to be doing. Like, she's talking to Darcy as if the two of them were the character in a novel as they are. So really bringing this self-awareness in the moment to life, this interaction between active bodies and minds and romantic formulas and formulas of class interaction and gender interaction. They stood some time without speaking a word, and she began to imagine that their silence was to laugh through the two dances, and at first was resolved not to break it, till suddenly fancying that it would be greater punishment to her partner to oblige him to speak, she made some slight observation on the dance. He replied and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him a second time with, again, this disarming honesty, stepping out of conventional expectations by explicitly. It's your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some sort of remark on the size of the room or the number of couples. Like, it's your move now. I'm waiting. He smiled and assured her that whatever she wished him to say should be said. Very well, that reply will do for the present. So the layers of irony are amazing. He says, okay, I'll reply however you want me to. And she's like, okay, that's a sufficient non-reply reply. Perhaps by and by I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but now we may be silent. Do you talk by rule then while you're dancing? Sometimes. The dance of reading. A person a character isn't one thing or another. The act of reading each other is an ongoing interactive performance that is in the end social reality. So what I've been emphasizing, I want to sort of, in these local cases, I want to kind of branch back out now, zoom out, and notice thematically the interplay of love and mortification, I think, is a key term in the novel. Shame. If you just look through all the instances of that word of people being mortified, it's a key aspect of the experience of love and growth. Ironically, mortification implies death, morbidity, but it's in Austen, and this is part of Austen's modernism, is it's a necessary part of the process of self-authorship, self-creation. You need to be challenged and disrupted. Going back now to that Wordsworthian trope of being confused, having the tables turned. Mortification is a key experience in so many of his poems that often, like the Lucy poems, involve actual death, but they teach us about the experience of love and empathy. So in Austen narratives, there's generally a formula distinguishing between first and second love. The first love being a naive infatuation, simple, seamless, falling in love with the surface, that is results in disappointment. It results in a recognition of a more complex reality than the first naive infatuation recognized. Mortification. That is then followed by the second experience of love, a more complex experience of love that has grown from the mortifying lesson of disappointment. This I think is correlated with, that's what it means to be able to read, ironically, That's what it means to be able to write oneself, to exercise the kind of social authorship authority that Elizabeth's perspective ultimately exercises by the end of the novel. Her perspective is the defining perspective of the social world around her. Mortification is the key note of Darcy's love for Elizabeth. He finds it mortifying from the beginning. He's mortified to be attracted, to find her eyes so beautiful, um, and she's mortified by him. She's so humiliated by his what he she overhears him saying about her, and she's so mortified by the way her family, behaves in his eyes. So the ironic of representation of love through what seems like the exact opposite. And that's nowhere so clear as in the first marriage proposal of Darcy's, where that mortification is like turned outward. I've talked about writing and reading and writing as a kind of dance, interplay of bodies, and the interplay of bodies that's dramatized here is so intense. His agitation, difficulty speaking, and then when he finally does speak, what he says here is so striking. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Very strong words, how ardently I admire and love you. So he, steps on himself when he tries to explain his love. It is flat-footed, and it, ends up they're just at cross purposes. What he thinks is an explanation of his love, she finds insulting. He tells her that his self-degradation testifies to the truth of his love, which is not wrong, but which is the wrong thing to say, which is like the bad performance, inept performance. So she, in turn, astonishes him, it insults him, and that this mutual, they get in a kind of dance of a mutual injury. And I just want to point out how love here, passion here, is correlated with cruelty. I want you to notice how mean, just ruthlessly mean, Darcy is here. This line, she saw with no slight indignation that he was listening with an air which proved him wholly unmoved by any feeling of remorse. He even looked at her with a smile of affective incredulity. So he's acting the part even more than he needs to in order to inflict as much pain as he can. And that is a perverse, mortifying testimony to the actuality of his affection for her. The most intensely mortifying event in the novel actually doesn't quite happen. It's what is imagined to potentially happen to Lydia. And what's interesting about this mortification is that it's highly correlated with modern life, the anonymity of London, and the mortification gets expressed through the impersonal, anonymous infrastructure of the modern metropolis, looking in these anonymous hotels, chasing these carriages. There's something particularly horrifying about losing Lydia in this anonymous urban infrastructure. Horrifying loss of the family, the security of the family structure, and horrifying also because of the kind of anonymous, innumerable other similar fates that London may contain. That, you know, they're looking to follow these coaches. And so Mr. Gardner meant to go to Epsom, the place where they last change horses, to see the postilions and try if anything he could make out from them. His object was to discover the number of the hackney coach. It had come from a fare from London. He thought the circumstance of a gentleman and a lady's moving from one carriage to another may be remarked, and meant to make inquiries. So the circumstance of a gentleman and a lady removing from one carriage to another, that's a vestige of the individuality, of the identity of Lydia. May yet save her if somebody noticed it, but it's on the cusp of disappearing, of dissolving into the anonymous mediation of urban life, of a mass urban metropolis. So that's different than the mortification of saying something embarrassing or being associated with somebody saying something embarrassing at a ball. This is a whole other level of mortification that has to do with the systemic structure of the urban metropolis, and all these new forms of speed and a transmission of identity and meaning in the urban context that Austen is marking in a particularly pointed, powerful way. I think this recognition of the threat to not just romance but to identity that the new modern urban world represents is crucial. The mortifying danger that Lydia is exposed to, that's also a function of reading. Crucially, it doesn't happen. She's saved from that fate. It's an imagined prospect. So it's something that characters are reading in. It's an experience of reading that's mortifying, of reading the coaches, of reading the situation that Lydia's fallen into. The characters, the Bennet family, are all reading this scenario just as we are as readers of the text. It's the mortification that they fear that Lydia, might happen. The consequences for Lydia, are severe. Total loss of reputation, which is to say loss of identity, which is to say, subjection to physical peril. It doesn't happen, but that's like fiction. We're reading a fiction. This, Pride and Prejudice also didn't happen. The story in Pride and Prejudice also didn't happen. But this hypothetical imagined mortification is a crucial part of the story, crucial part of learning and growth that the characters go through. So that's telling us also something about what the novel, the hypothetical experience of the novel stands to teach us readers. So I want to show you a little video by one of the best climbers in the world, talking about the most scared he's ever been. The way he talks about fear is interesting and illuminating about this, its correlation with reading.
Most scared you've ever been, and why? Well, it took me to become a father to discover that climbing, fear for yourself in climbing is not actually all that scary. Being scared for someone else that you care about is far, far more scary. So the most scared I've ever been by an order of magnitude was when My daughter fell out of her pram and fell down a set of stairs when she was 1 or 2, but the next morning she was absolutely fine and no lasting damage. Actually, if I think about it directly, I still get quite upset. So that's such as the lasting scar that it leaves on my mind, despite the fact that there was actually no long-term consequences. But since this vlog is about climbing, I'll tell you about the most scared I've ever been in climbing. And that moment was right here where I'm stood just now. As I say, we're on Binny and Shoes. 2 years ago, I had a project up in the fortress here, which was going.
So what's interesting is he emphasizes it's much scarier to be scared for someone else than it is to be scared for yourself. The same point, that Austin makes about sort of the web, the social, that we exist in our relationships, that we experience vicariously empathy more than just emotions that are limited to our personal individual concerns. But even hypothetically, imaginary fears may be more powerful than real ones. He says that it didn't happen, but I still, when I think about my daughter's fall, I'm still disturbed by it, even though nothing happened. It turned out to be okay. It was all hypothetical. So he's saying, this guy's, does all this scary stuff. He says the most scared was something that happened to somebody else that actually didn't even happen. So that's really telling about what novels stand to teach us, that they're imaginary scenarios of empathizing with imaginary people, but they give us real experiences of real patterning of social life and emotions. And that brings us back to Wordsworth, because that's the key way of looking at Wordsworth is the patterning of emotion and social life. But one of the most famous characterizations of Wordsworth from Jeffrey Hartman, the halted traveler, and we've seen plenty of examples of that trope of the poet, I wandered lonely as a cloud, old man wandering, Simon Lee, wandering and then halted and surprised by a stranger, having this disruptive experience, reorienting the poet's perspective in a crucial way. It's a good way of characterizing key moments of learning and growth for Elizabeth, who gains new insight into Darcy through these surrogate representations of his character. So kind of by reading the land, by reading his estate, by the way in which she reads, the way in which he's represented in his portrait, she learns about him through these surrogate representations of Darcy's actual character, and thereby demonstrates to us what reading's about, what reality is about. The reality is about this experience of reading. Like, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Wordsworth is known as the founder of the school of lake poetry. Elizabeth pointedly plans a trip with the gardeners. This organic metaphor, as often is the case with Austen's names, registered very pointedly in the name of the gardeners. The gardeners plan a trip with her, cultivate plans to travel to the lakes. But instead, as a surrogate replacement for the lakes, they traveled to Pemberley, where their travel is halted by the prospect of the beautiful land, the beautiful estate, learning just the kind of appreciation for the land that Edmund Burke espouses. But it's important to notice how clearly Austen is staging a scene of aesthetic appreciation. They gradually ascended for half a mile and then found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence where the wood ceased, and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House. was not her I, but the I. What difference does that make? It anonymizes. It's not just about her private experience. The way in which she is arrested personally is not just about her. It's about a value that would arrest the I per se, any I. Um, she's appreciating a value that isn't just about her personal taste. So that's mentioned before, distinguishing feature of aesthetic value, unlike our taste for certain kinds of foods. It's not idiosyncratically mine. It's appreciating a experience of the moment, being in the moment, but it's not just about me. I remember that Wordsworth's dissolving into the crowd in the moment of his experience of the daffodils. Finding myself in the moment, I'm appreciating something special about this moment. I'm caught in the moment, but it's not just about me. I'm also kind of transcending myself and having appreciating something impersonal and beyond myself at the same time. The stream of some natural importance is the interplay, the same kind of paradox. Um, I'm finding myself and losing myself at the same time. I'm in the moment, but also transcending at the same time. It's natural and designed. It seems there's something accidental, um, but purposeful, of some natural importance, was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She'd never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been more so little counteracted by awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. She sees a reflection of herself, or an imagined self. She finds herself in the way she imagines herself. And later, when she explores Pemberley, she finds Darcy in how he's imagined, how he's represented in his portrait. And this is maybe the most powerful, precise description of reading in the novel. The way in which Elizabeth reads the portrait, she reads him. Even more importantly, she reads herself in how she reads him. That's the essential, romantic irony, central romantic conception of the purpose of art is to provide a kind of mechanism for the reader, for the reader's own self creation. So how does this happen? How does Austen describe that? So Elizabeth standing before the portrait of Darcy. At this moment, in Elizabeth's mind, a more gentle sensation towards the original than she had ever felt at the height of their acquaintance. So isn't that amazing? And isn't it, novel-like? She's saying how we can have more powerful feelings towards through fiction than through reality. The commendation bestowed on him by Miss Reynolds was of no trifling nature. What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? That's a very key point and question. What can a servant testify to uniquely? As a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship. Again, who he is represented by all these surrogates, the way in which he is reflected in this network of relationships that surround him. And most importantly, maybe, by the most lowly, the most humble. Every idea was favorable to his character, and as she stood before the canvas on which he was represented and fixed his eyes upon herself, she fixed his eyes on her. She sees him seeing her. She thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before. She is more grateful for his regard. She's seeing him in a way she's can be grateful for than she ever had before. Such a complex, imaginative interplay of self and other that is getting described here. And again, this complexity is what novels give us practice in. And I think what Austen's suggesting is that's how reality is fixed, through this awareness of the complexity of social interactions and kind of authoring of the dance of the interplay. That's what writing does. If you keep a journal, or that's why I'm encouraging you to write in this class as much as you can. Power of writing is to represent a kind of complexity that you otherwise wouldn't. The act of writing fixes it, the way she here fixes his eyes on her. She's defining how he sees her. She's authoring his view of her. I think Austen is suggesting that's the power of writing and reading, writing through reading, the way in which she reads the painting as a way of writing what's in the painting, and what's the reality that's represented. The crucial power of writing and reading is further underscored by the pivotal role played by Darcy's letter. The most important interaction between the two again takes place through these surrogates. She interacts with his painting, he writes her a letter. Their most intimate interaction is virtual and indirect, mediated by these kinds of artwork, writing and painting. And Austen really goes into the detail and process of Elizabeth's reading of this letter and underscores how it's not just reading, but rereading. Again, that experience of like first and second love, reprocessing experience is very reminiscent of Wordsworth. Wordsworthian recollection, that we sort of find ourselves through reprocessing. It's lovely and remarkable how this reading, is initiated in the word, like in a Wordsworth poem, in nature, rambling through the grove of the countryside. It's her ramble is interrupted by this, stranger she sees first at a distance. Turns out to be Darcy. It delivers this letter. So, as in a Wordsworth poem, this nature is experience, a rhythm of mind, a rhythm of walking, interacting with the environment, are encoded in writing. And emotion is the process of rereading this letter cultivates new emotions. So I want to draw your attention to one final example of free and direct discourse, sort of the climactic moment of the narrative, the second proposal. And here, how would you compare it to the first one? There are such strong words, strong bottled up emotion and drama in that first scene. And here it's kind of dissolved. That is to say that we're left to imagine what Elizabeth says. It's all become vague and impersonal. She doesn't see his eye. We don't hear her assent to his proposal. We're left to imagine it. And that puts us in the position of Lizzie herself as a reader of the scene. Um, and uh, that's the point, is that the most, vivid experience of reality is the capacity that Lizzie ultimately exercises to author it, to imagine it on her own terms. What Austen gives us is the implicit experience. We're no longer told how the eye looks. We're left now to imagine it for ourselves. And again, that's the most real experience is the one that's left implicit. Had Elizabeth been able to encounter his eye, she might have seen how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. It's an aesthetic judgment that we're told happens, but we're left to imagine the details, the content of how it happens for ourselves. Though she could not look, she could listen, and he told her of feelings which improving of what importance she was to him, made his affection every moment more valuable. So she's delineating a form of an experience of love and letting the reader fill in the emotional content.